the podcast exclusively for association executives and members. Each week, Jeff interviews association executives about their victories, igniting new ideas for you to create greater value for your members. And now, Jeff Tippett.
You've joined us for today's episode of Victory by Association. Today's show is brought to you by Targeted Persuasion, Public Affairs, and Communications. When your association has a policy prescription you're trying to advance or stop, you need the power of targeted persuasion, helping you build a successful grassroots campaign designed to move legislators and other elected officials. When you need to win, you need targeted persuasion. Learn more at targetedpersuasion.com and check out our show notes for the link. Today, I'm excited to welcome David Murray to the show. David, how are you?
I'm doing well, Jeff. Thanks for having me on.
Man, I'm so excited to talk today to get some knowledge here out of you that will help our other association executives. Well, let's start out by just giving a little bit of context. Tell us a little bit about your association work background. I'm just generally speaking.
So I am the executive director of an organization called MDVSIA. It's a mouthful, but it stands for the Maryland, DC, Virginia Solar Energy Industries Association. We are a state trade association that represents about 160 solar installers, developers, financiers, advocates, and everyone in between. And we're one of the oldest state solar trade associations. We've been around since about 1984, when a bunch of plumbers got together and said, hey, this solar thermal business seems to be exciting. We should develop a trade association around it. And now we represent some publicly traded companies and some of the most innovative companies in America right now. And so it's a great trade association. We just have two full-time staff, but we have a couple lobbyists and consultants and legal counsel that we work with, and it's a really great time to be in the industry and represent solar.
I love it. I can't wait to get in and talk to some about the work that you are doing. Before we hit that, tell us a little bit about David. What's something interesting, unique, or different, something people wouldn't find on your LinkedIn profile, but they might find interesting about you?
So a few years ago, I did a road trip from Cape Town, South Africa, all the way up to northern Botswana, over to the deserts of Namibia and the Atlantic Ocean, and then back down to Cape Town. It was about 4,500 kilometers. It was a road trip after I had just gotten my master's in energy and development studies at the University of Cape Town that I did in a tiny little car. It's a Volkswagen Polo, but it survived the road trip, and it was one of the greatest trips I've ever been on. I went with about 3 friends, and we saw a wild elephant and elk and slept out under the stars. So I definitely miss that when I'm working from my office here in Washington, D.C., but I hope to go back to Southern Africa at some point soon.
Man, you are setting the dream out there for me. That is amazing. I just can't even imagine what you experienced, what you saw. If I ever end up in DC at the same time you are, we might have to grab a beer and talk a little bit more about that. That's fantastic. Well, talk to us a little bit about a victory or success or something that you guys have done that you'd like for us to get into today.
Absolutely. So MDVSIA was instrumental in passing the Maryland Clean Energy Jobs Act earlier this year. The Maryland Clean Energy Jobs Act was a bill that mandated that 50% of Maryland's energy must come from renewable resources by 2030, and 14.5% of it will come from solar energy. It was one of the more ambitious solar policies in the country that, because of the work of solar companies from Annapolis to the Eastern Shore to Western Maryland, were able to advocate for, it managed to pass. And because of it, we'll create about 20,000 new solar jobs. These are jobs that are well paying. The average entry-level job for a solar installer is $18 an hour. So it was a really challenging policy, because anytime you radically change a state's energy portfolio, you're going to have a lot of folks who are concerned about what that means and how that will change the state. But in the end, the industry won out, and it was because we were united for this legislation, and we'd really built a great coalition of advocates, not just in the solar industry, but in environmental justice communities, environmental advocates, labor, with the wind industry. Folks were really supportive of making this bill happen.
That's fantastic. So talk to me a little bit about, because this, we build grassroots campaigns. One of my companies does it. So I understand pulling all these people together, but it sounds like a really big accomplishment, even given some of the national mindset right now as well. Talk to me a little bit about some barriers or some obstacles, or maybe people that came against you and opposed you. And I'm not asking you to talk bad of any other people, but just tell us a little bit about that experience and how you overcame some of that.
Sure. So one of the biggest challenges early on is building consensus. So as any trade association knows, if you have a group of, say, 30 companies, you're going to have 60 different opinions. And that's because many people within a company will disagree with each other, right? So something that some of our board members did and were very good about was they wanted to have several ideas out there, but really make sure that the best ideas sort of floated to the top. And so folks early on did a lot of shuttle diplomacy, not only within the solar industry, but outside of it, to say, hey, what's a policy that you're comfortable with? Don't tell me what your ideal one is, but out of these options, what can we get comfortable with that your business is going to go out and show up and support? And that was the building blocks of the Clean Energy Jobs Act. It was a bill that the solar industry was united around. And that was probably the biggest challenge, because a lot of different business models had varying ideas of what an ideal policy would be. But because of the leadership of some folks on my board, we were able to coalesce around a policy that really benefited everybody, and then still achieved the goals of some of our fellow advocates in the wind industry and the environmental movement, folks that were concerned about the bill's cost. And so we did that just through consistent engagement and making sure folks' voices were heard in the beginning, and were kept in the tent as we move forward. And so I would say the second challenge too is educating legislators. Solar energy is something that's very new to people. Whenever I speak before a crowd that's unfamiliar with the business, I say, how many folks as grandparents were in agriculture? Everyone raises their hand. Well, how many folks have their grandparents as solar installers? Of course, no one's hand goes up. And so when we think about what our landscape will look like, whether it's or we think about what a solar farm looks like, it's something very new to people. And whenever you have something new that's complex, that involves an electricity grid, batteries, and energy from the sun, you have to do a lot of explaining. So we made sure that our talking points were meant for fifth graders. That's kind of the running joke, is to say, hey, will your fifth grader understand this talking point? And if it's a yes, then it's good to go. You can chop it with a legislator or their staff. And so we had simple talking points. We not only spoke to the importance that it would bring to Maryland, but specific people. So we made sure we had solar installers, people who used to be earning $11, $12 an hour. Now they're earning $18 an hour, come in and talk about the opportunity that solar energy has provided to them. And as soon as a legislator can put a face to a particular issue, you really opened the door to a conversation. And so the association did its best to make sure that solar companies called their legislator, they mailed them, they invited them to come down to their office to walk through and see their company and meet some of their employees. And that really helped personalize the industry in a way that gave our bill momentum.
Absolutely. David, you have just I'm sitting here taking notes as you're talking, and you have just given us nugget after nugget after nugget. And I speak professionally, and I speak on the power of persuasive communication. And one of the things I talk about is exactly what you've just hit on, is that message. In fact, in our podcast, I give away a free chapter from my book, and I'll do that in a few minutes. But crafting that message, and you're exactly right. Like the average person reads on a 7th or 8th grade level. And anything that we do to talk above that level isn't going to make them think that, that we're almighty and that we're smart. We're actually going to isolate them. So I love your model of this whole 5th grade test. Like, can your 5th grader understand it? Because you're exactly right. And then the whole thing of the face as well. Sometimes we just get wrapped up in the language implications and we forget about the people. So I love the fact that you brought people in, you put a face to the campaign, and you talked about the value proposition of what this is bringing, how you're changing income, how you're creating better jobs, higher paying jobs for people. It sounds like, David, it sounds like you guys checked all of the boxes in your work.
We've really tried to bring all voices to the table, and I think when you build a coalition, you have to not only be welcoming, but you have to make sure that folks are in lockstep. And granted, we had some challenges along the way. We had to change parts of our bill in order to make it ultimately pass muster through the Senate and House committees. But with that kind of day-to-day craziness that was legislative session, we eventually got it done.
That's great. Well, David, let me ask you this, and you can keep this at the 30,000-foot level. It's just fine. But for other association executives, and let's keep this around the government relations space, maybe for association executives that might be looking to advance or stop policy prescriptions, that maybe even have something that seems insurmountable in front of them. As someone who's kind of rounded the hill, the mountain already, what are 2 or 3 talking points or two or 3 points of advice that you would give to association executives just to help them focus and maybe even change some mindset as they look at what's in front of them?
I think keeping both nimble and flexible is something that is important to winning policy fights. I think a lot of folks have this mindset of it's my way or the highway, and they're so married to these ideas that they are not willing to consider alternative paths that can bring in other stakeholders. You actually see that play out in Virginia. We also represent the solar industry down there. And we have learned that by working constructively with the utilities there, Appalachian Power Company and Dominion, we have been able to realize a lot of positive policies for the solar industry. And granted, that's not something that some of our members want, but other ones say, listen, if this is a win, it's kicking a field goal instead of scoring a touchdown, we'll take it, because it's all about making sure that we can provide solar power to the state. And so I think keeping flexible and around what your policy goals are important. I think being consistent and being patient and showing up is another one. The more folks that you have that build relationships with legislators and that can put a face to your industry, the better. And a lot of these major pieces of legislation, they really need a couple years to grow. I think when I started and didn't get any bills passed in 2018, I felt really conscious of that. Here I was ready to make a big splash as the new executive director, and both the bills that I was trying to get passed failed. And a more senior policy advocate said, listen, man, these things take 2 to 3 years. Just keep at it. Make sure that you use the off season to get your companies in speaking with legislators to build a case for your policy through op-eds and through a really diverse set of champions, and things start to play out. So I think things take a while to really come about, but if the winds are at your back and you build a really strong case with many different voices and folks under the tent, you can really go far.
David, that's all fantastic. I love all that you said. I think you're just right on, and especially this talk. And in my book, I discuss this, and from stage, as I talk about persuasion and how we move people, I talk about binary versus non-binary options. And to your point, sometimes we think it's like my way or the highway. It's left or right, yes or no, black or white. But it's maybe occasionally sometimes it is that way, but oftentimes or more times than not, they're non-binary options. We got to be open and flexible to move the pieces around, and we may not all walk away with everything that we want, but we can likely walk away with something better than we started with, and something better than had we done nothing. So I think it's fantastic, all the points that you're bringing there. Let me ask you this, David, as we start to wrap this up. Every association has some amazing volunteers. Associations could not make it without those volunteers. And I just happen to think there's great value, especially in our culture today, to really show gratitude and to show appreciation to others. So I wanted to offer, I know you got lots of volunteers that you work with, so we're not saying anyone's better than the other, but is there a particular association superhero volunteer you'd like to give a shout out to today, just to say thanks?
I could think of a number of them, but I'm going to give it to our board president, Rick Peters. He runs a company of about 45 employees out in Annapolis, and Rick was managing a growing business in Annapolis, yet he showed up to the legislature several times a week to show face and to help kind of mentor other solar companies on advocacy and walking the halls. He's been a great champion for the association, really spent a lot of volunteer hours making sure that we not only develop internal consensus and we bring new folks to the table, but a lot of the thankless tasks like managing staff and ensuring that our budget's up to speed. And so it's these kinds of business leaders like Rick that really make the work that we do as an association possible.
That's fantastic. Great shout out there. Well, David, what's the best way for people to reach out and connect with you if they have questions, or if they want to run some things past you, especially in this area of government relations and finding success there? What's the best way for people to find you?
Sure. It's just my name, David, at mdvseia.org. And our website is www.mdvseia.org.
Fantastic. And we'll add those to the show notes from today's episode. David, thank you. And thank you all for listening and being part of today's show. My gift to you, as I mentioned earlier, is a free chapter from my book. This chapter is on crafting a simple message, all around a message that people can understand, they can wrap their heads around. And in this chapter, I have a 4-part proven system that helps you develop that message that will persuade other people. The chapter is yours free just by texting the word persuade to 66866. Persuade to 66866. Thank you again, David, and thank you all for being a part of today's show. I'll see you next week as we discover another victory by association.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to Victory by Association with Jeff Tippett. If you've enjoyed, please subscribe, rate, and review. Be sure to check out the show notes for links relating to this episode. For information about becoming a sponsor or guest, please email podcast@jefftippett.com.